There is a wedding video on Facebook with 61,000 views. It shows a man in a white barong dancing with a woman in a gown the color of cream, and behind them there is a house with lights strung from every eave, and 200 people are clapping, and a drone is filming all of it from above, so that the whole scene looks like something from a film about a life that is genuinely happening to someone genuinely lucky. The comments say things like goals, and God is good, and true love exists. The man in the barong is 74 years old now. He watches that video sometimes on the phone. That is the last expensive thing he owns, in a room in Olongapo that costs €90 a month and fits a bed, a fan, and a plastic chair. Nobody in the comments knows that part. He hasn't told them. This is the story of what lives in the gap between the footage and the room. The video starts the same way every time I watch it. There is a shot of the house from the road, lit up the way Grace had planned for months, fairy lights on every surface, and then the drone lifts, and you can see the whole property from above, and it genuinely looks like something. It genuinely looks like a life I built, because it was a life I built. That's the part that makes watching it complicated. Not that it was fake. It wasn't fake. It was real and it happened, and I was there, and now I'm in a room 20 minutes up the road, watching it on a cracked phone screen at 11:30 at night, while a fan moves the warm air around and accomplishes nothing. Let me tell you how I got to that wedding first. Then I'll tell you how I got from the wedding to here. I worked on the Irish ferries service for 31 years. Engineer, then senior engineer, then the title that sounds grander than it was, chief engineer on the Rosslare to Pembroke route, which is a 7-hour crossing in most conditions, and considerably more eventful in winter. I know engines the way some men know land, intuitively, by feel, the way a problem sounds different from how it looks, and you learn over decades to hear the difference. I retired at 67 when the company restructured and the offer came, and I took it because my body was asking for the asking, and I had the sense to listen. My wife Bridget had died 5 years before I retired. Breast cancer. 3 years from the first diagnosis. We had been married for 34 years and had 2 boys. Kieran, who lived in London in finance, and Seamus, who farmed outside Clonakilty, and rang me on Sundays with the specific warmth of a man who doesn't say the important things directly, but makes sure you hear them in everything else he says. I had a house in Cork, a pension that was decent, and the particular quality of life that a man has when the person who made his house a home is gone, and he has not found a way to make it that himself. I went to the Philippines at 69. Not for romance, not specifically. I want to say that because it's true, and because the story gets reductive if you skip it. I went because a man I'd worked with on the ferries, a Filipino engineer named Eddie who'd been on our crew for 8 years before going home, had told me for years that if I ever wanted to see where he came from, he'd show me. And after Bridget died, and the retirement came, and the Cork house got to a size that felt wrong for one person, I rang Eddie and said I was coming. Eddie lived in Olongapo, in Zambales province, 2 hours north of Manila on the coast. His family was there, wife, kids, mother, the extended architecture of a Filipino household that I found noisy and warm and completely unlike anything I'd grown up in. I stayed with them for 2 weeks and Eddie drove me around and showed me the coast and the town and the mountains that you could see on clear days from the bay, and something about the physical reality of the place, the scale of it, the color of the water, the fact that everything was sufficiently different from Cork that I couldn't accidentally be reminded of Bridget by the wrong angle of afternoon light. Something about it suited me in a way I hadn't expected. I came back twice more in the following year. On the 3rd trip I met Grace. She was a friend of Eddie's wife Maricel. She came to a Sunday lunch that Eddie's family hosted for what seemed like most of the barangay, and she arrived late and sat at the far end of the long table set up in the garden, and spent the meal talking to the woman beside her with the absorbed quality of someone who was genuinely in conversation rather than performing sociality. She was 30 then. She worked as a cashier at a supermarket near the town center and had grown up in Subic, 20 minutes from Olongapo, in a family that Eddie described, when I asked later, as decent people in difficult circumstances, which was about as much as Eddie would say about anyone's family. I talked to her after lunch. Her English was clear, and her conversation was direct in a way that reminded me, and I know how this sounds, but I'm telling the truth, of the way Bridget had been direct. Not the same woman, not trying to say that. Just the same quality of saying the thing you mean, rather than the thing that's easier to say. I asked what she thought of the town, whether she liked living near the bay, whether she'd ever wanted to go somewhere else. She said the bay was the best thing about the place, and she didn't know about somewhere else, because she'd never been, and so she had no comparison. She said, "You can't know if you want to leave somewhere until you know what leaving gets you." I thought about that sentence for days afterward. It was the clearest thing anyone had said to me in a conversation that wasn't about engines in a long time. We exchanged numbers before I left Olongapo. I didn't expect it to go further than that, because I was 69 and she was 30, and those numbers don't point toward anything obvious. But she texted me 2 days after I flew back to Manila for my onward flight, and I texted back, and the conversation that followed over the next 3 months was the kind that doesn't run out, where one thing leads to another thing, and the hours go by without you tracking them, and you look at the time, and it's 2 in the morning, and you were supposed to be asleep at 10. I told Kieran in London. He asked good questions in the careful way of a son who has watched his father manage grief, and who doesn't want to say the wrong thing. He asked how long I'd known her, what she was like, what I thought was happening. I told him what I knew, and what I thought, and he said, "Dad, just be careful." I said I would. He said, "I mean with your heart, not just your money." I said I knew what he meant. He said, "Okay, I trust you." Seamus's response, on the Sunday call, was more Seamus. He said, "She's 30? And I said yes, and he said right, and there was a pause, and then he said, "Are you happy when you're talking to her?" And I said I was, and he said, "Okay then." And we talked about the weather in Clonakilty for 20 minutes. I went back to Olongapo in month 4. Grace and I spent 2 weeks together in person for the first time, beyond the one afternoon at Eddie's lunch, and what I found was that the person who had been so clear and present across 3 months of messages was the same person in the room, which is not always the case, and which I valued specifically. She showed me Subic, where she'd grown up, and the street where her family's house was, and the school she'd gone to, and the church where her parents had been married, and the way she talked about those places had the texture of someone showing you their actual life, rather than a presentation of it. I met her parents on that trip. Her father, Rodrigo, was a small, quiet man who had worked at the Subic Bay port, and who shook my hand, and said very little, and watched a great deal, with dark eyes that didn't miss anything. Her mother, Cora, was the opposite, warm and loud and immediately treating me as something between a guest to be fed and a project to be organized, and she made a lunch that would have fed 8, and was visibly pleased when I ate as much as I did, which was considerable, because I am a man who has always responded well to good food. There was a younger brother, Benji, who was 24 and worked at a hardware store, and who I liked immediately, in the uncomplicated way you like people who are exactly what they appear to be. I flew back to Cork in love, which is not a word I'd used about anything since Bridget, and which felt significant in proportion to how long it had been absent. I sat in the Cork house with the phone and the messages and the video calls, and I told myself that the numbers, the age difference, the distance, the circumstances, were real factors that I was taking seriously, and that I was not a man being led somewhere by need rather than judgment. I believe I was telling myself the truth about that. I believe I was genuinely trying to see clearly. The problem with trying to see clearly when you want something is that the wanting affects the seeing in ways you can't fully account for. She came to Cork for 3 weeks in the spring. I showed her Bridget's city, which was also my city, and she walked through it with genuine curiosity and asked about things I'd stopped seeing because I'd seen them too long. We went out to the harbor one morning, and I showed her the sea from a height, and she said, "Your sea is different from ours. Yours looks like it has something to say." I asked what she thought ours was saying. She said, "I don't know yet. Something heavy." I told her I loved her on the last evening before she flew back. I said it carefully, with the full weight of what I meant by it at 70, which is different from the weight of it at 35 or 45. Heavier with the awareness of how much time has already gone, lighter with the awareness of how much less there is to lose by honesty. She looked at me for a moment and then she said, "I love you too, Fergus. I wouldn't have come to your cold city if I didn't." We married in the Philippines 2 years after that first lunch at Eddie's. I know the timeline sounds quick, and I know what people will say about it, and the honest answer is that 2 years of daily contact, and 5 visits, and 3 weeks in Cork is not a small sample. I was not young, and I was not careless. I was a man who had decided that this was the thing, and who had done what due diligence looked like at 71, and had decided to proceed. The wedding cost 28,000 euros. I planned to spend 20,000 euros, and it became 28,000 euros through the accumulation of details that each cost a little more than estimated, which I understand is the universal experience of wedding planning, but which in retrospect was also an early template for how money moved in that relationship. The roast pigs were Grace's mother's insistence, and I didn't argue. The live band was Grace's idea, and it was a good one. They played for 4 hours, and the dancing was something I hadn't done since Bridget's funeral in reverse. Which sounds wrong, but was the right way to describe it. The last time I'd been in the center of a room full of people who cared about me was a grief occasion, and now I was in the center of a room full of people who cared about Grace, and by extension me, and it felt like something returning that I'd written off. The drone was Benji's idea, and the footage it produced is, objectively, beautiful. I'm not going to pretend it isn't beautiful. The house had been under construction since the year before the wedding. I want to describe how it happened, because the house is the center of the financial story, and I want to be honest about how it was proposed and how I responded. Grace had raised it in the 2nd year of our relationship, before we were engaged, before we were even formally committed to a future in the concrete sense. She raised it the way she raised things, directly, without decoration. She said that if there was going to be a future between us that was permanent, and she thought there was, then a house in the Philippines made sense, because it would be hers legally, in a way that gave her a foundation that wasn't dependent on him staying, meaning me, meaning if something happened to me she would have something. I respected that reasoning. I still do. She was 32 years old, and she was being clear-eyed about the arithmetic of our situation in a way that I found mature rather than mercenary. A 71-year-old man and a 32-year-old woman are not the same kind of gamble for both of them, and her asking for a house was not unreasonable. What I didn't think carefully enough about was the difference between providing for her future and creating a future that had more room for her than for me. The house cost 175,000 euros. It was built in Subic, close to her parents, on land that was registered in Grace's name for the standard reason that Philippine law doesn't allow foreign nationals to own land. I designed some of it, the main room, the kitchen proportions, the garden wall, and I visited 4 times during construction and stood on the site in the heat and felt the specific satisfaction of a man making something physical that will outlast him. The house was real, and it was good, and when it was finished, it was the nicest building on that street, which I didn't intend as a statement, but which became one regardless. We lived in it after the wedding. I had a 3-month tourist visa, and we applied for a retirement visa through Survey, the Special Resident Retirees Visa Program, which required a deposit and documentation, and took longer than the initial application suggested. While we waited, I extended the tourist visa twice, and paid the extension fees, and spent those months learning the rhythms of the house and the neighborhood, and trying to understand what ordinary life in Subic looked like for Grace, who had spent her whole life there, and whose version of ordinary was entirely different from mine. Those months were good. I want to be clear about that because if I only tell the part that went wrong, I'll be doing something false to the record. The mornings in that house were good. The kitchen Grace cooked in was good. The evenings on the small porch where I'd sit after dinner and watch the street and hear the neighborhood sounds going through their cycle. I was in my 70s in a house I'd built in a country that wasn't mine, further from Cork than I'd ever lived, and I woke up most mornings feeling that this was where I was supposed to be, which was not a feeling I'd had in Cork since Bridget died. Benji's business proposal came in month 8 of our marriage. Not a surprise in the sense that I hadn't known something like it would come. Grace had mentioned several times that Benji was working at the hardware store but wanted to start his own thing, that he had ideas, that he needed capital but not a lot. The proposal was a small welding and fabrication shop in Olongapo. Benji had experience and a customer base if he had equipment. The estimate was €22,000 for the initial setup. Grace brought it to me on a Sunday after church, in the way that she brought the things she wanted. Directly, with the information laid out, not performing hesitation but not performing certainty either. Just the facts, with the question underneath them. I said, "Let me see the estimate." She produced it. It was handwritten but detailed, itemized, with supplier names and unit costs for the welding equipment and the lease deposit on the space. I spent 2 evenings going through it. I knew enough about fabrication equipment from the ferries to understand what a realistic budget looked like, and nothing in the estimate was implausible. I said yes. I transferred €22,000 to an account Benji opened for the business, and I watched the shop take shape over the following months, with the interest of a man who understands metal, and was glad to see it being used well. Benji was good at the work. That's the truth. The shop opened, and it was real, and the customers came, and Benji worked hard, and it was not a fraud in the way that a fabricated business is a fraud. It was a real business that I'd funded, with money I'd earned on the Rosslare to Pembroke crossing in 40-knot winds on winter mornings, and Benji ran it with genuine competence. I'm telling you this because I don't want to make this story simpler than it was. Not everything that happened was a lie. Some of it was real, and some of it cost me anyway. The changes in Grace happened slowly enough that I couldn't name a date when they started. I look back now and I think the change began somewhere in the 2nd year of the marriage, but it was gradual, the way a tide is gradual. You don't notice the water rising, because at any given moment it doesn't look different from 5 minutes before, and then you look down, and your boots are wet. She started spending more evenings at her parents' house. 1 night a week, which was understandable. Her parents were aging, and she was their eldest daughter, and that relationship had obligations I respected. Then 2 nights, which I adjusted to. Then some weeks 3, which I noted without raising immediately because I didn't want to be the foreign husband who couldn't understand Filipino family ties. She started leaving her phone face down. A small thing. I noticed it because I am an observant man, and I notice small things. And I noticed it and said nothing, because the observant man's trap is that he catalogues everything and challenges nothing until the catalog is so full that the challenge, when it comes, is about everything at once rather than any specific thing, which is the least productive version of the conversation. She stopped asking about Cork. Early in our relationship, she had asked constantly about the ferries, about the crossings, about Bridget, about my sons, about the particular quality of Irish winter mornings that I described once, and she asked me to describe again. In the 3rd year, she stopped asking. Conversations became about Subic, about her parents, about the house, about Benji's shop. My life before arrived became a room she didn't enter anymore. I rang Kieran from the porch one evening in the 3rd year. He asked how things were, and I said fine, in a tone that he heard correctly, because Kieran is his mother's son in the way that matters, which is the ability to hear what's in the space around the words. He said, "Dad, honestly?" I said honestly, things were different from the 1st year, and I wasn't sure what to make of it. He said, "Different how?" I told him about the evenings at her parents' and the phone, and the conversations. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "Have you talked to her about it?" I said, "Not directly." He said, "You should talk to her directly, Dad. You always know how to do that when you decide to." I talked to Grace the following week. I chose a morning, over coffee, before the day organized itself into things that would make the conversation easier to postpone. I said I'd noticed some changes in how we were together, and I wanted to understand them. I said I wasn't accusing her of anything. I was asking. She looked at her coffee for a moment. Then she said, "I think we're in different places, Fergus." I said, "Tell me what you mean." She said, "You're happy here. The house, the routine, the life you've built. You're settled." I said, "Yes." she said. I don't know if I'm settled. I'm 34. I thought I knew what I wanted, and I still think some of it is what I wanted, but some of it. She stopped. I said, some of it what? She said, I don't know how to say this without it sounding like I'm saying something I'm not saying. I said, say it anyway. She said, I think I imagined a different kind of life than this one. Not a better one. Just different. And I don't know what to do with that. It was the most honest thing she said to me in the last 2 years of our marriage. I respected her for it even as I sat across from her in the kitchen of the house I'd built, and felt the ground becoming uncertain in a way I hadn't felt since I was standing on the deck of a ferry in a North Channel gale at 52, and had a moment of understanding that the ship was smaller than the sea. The man she was seeing, whose name I know and will not use here because his name is irrelevant to anything that matters about the story, I found out about him in the 4th year. Not through drama, not through a confrontation. I found out because Rodrigo, her father, came to the house on a weekday morning when Grace was out and sat at my kitchen table and told me with the directness of a man who had something to say and had decided to say it. He said his daughter was seeing someone. He said he was sorry. He said he was telling me himself because he believed I deserved to know and because he was not willing to be in his house with the knowledge while I remained in mine without it. I thanked him. He shook my hand and left. I sat at the kitchen table for a very long time. I did not shout. I want to tell you that not because I want credit for it, but because it's true, and because the absence of shouting was a choice I made consciously that day, and that I still believe was the right one. I am 73 years old and I have been on rough water many times, and the thing that rough water teaches you, if you survive enough of it, is that panic uses energy you will need later, and that the first obligation in any crisis is to understand the situation before you respond to it. What I understood that day, sitting at my kitchen table, was this. The house was Grace's. The marriage was ending. The man she was with was local to her, closer to her age, present in her actual daily life in a way that I, with my 3-month visa cycles and my Cork accent and my references to engine rooms on the Pembroke crossing, was not and could not be. I had come to the Philippines to build something, and I had built something, and what I had built was a life for her, rather than a life with her. And the distinction I hadn't examined clearly enough from the beginning had become, in year 4, the only thing that mattered. I moved out in December. Not dramatically. I told Grace I thought we both knew where things were, and that I wasn't going to make it uglier than it needed to be. She cried, which I believed and still believe was genuine. She said she was sorry. I said I believed her. I asked her to be kind to Rodrigo, who had done the right thing in a situation that didn't have a right thing, and she said she would. I packed 2 bags, which turned out to be enough for the things I actually needed, and I left the house that had my design in its proportions, and my money in its foundations, and that had my wedding photograph on the wall in the main room, which I didn't take because it was her wall now. The boarding house in Olongapo costs me €90 a month. I found it through Eddie, who was horrified by the situation, and who helped me find somewhere clean and safe, and whose wife Maricel brought me food twice in the first week, in the manner of someone who has decided that a man in difficulty should not also have to cook for himself. Eddie asked if I wanted to go home to Cork. I said I didn't know yet. I've been in the boarding house for 8 months. The room is what it is. A bed, a fan, a plastic chair, a window that looks out at a concrete wall and gets morning light for about 40 minutes before the angle moves. I have my phone, which is the last expensive thing I own among the things I carry, and I have my pension, which is modest but sufficient for a €90 a month room and 3 meals a day at a local canteen, and the bus to Olongapo town when I need it. I am not destitute. I am not in danger. I am a 74-year-old man sleeping in a small room who has lost €260,000 to a marriage and a house and a wedding and a brother-in-law's welding shop and 4 years of transfers for costs I don't have a complete accounting of, and who is trying to work out what comes next without pretending he has a clear picture of it yet. The total is €260,000. I calculated it once, properly, with the bank records I still have access to online, and I've looked at the number enough times that it has lost most of its power to shock me. The house was 175,000 euros. The wedding was 28,000 euros. Benji's shop was 22,000 euros. The remaining 35,000 euros is the accumulated transfers over 4 years, the medical costs and the family occasions, and the things I covered without keeping individual records because keeping records had felt, at the time, like distrust. Seamus rang me last month on the Sunday call. We've maintained the Sunday call throughout everything, even when I was managing the move-out, and even in the first weeks in the boarding house. He doesn't know the full situation. He knows the marriage ended. He knows I'm in Olongapo. He thinks I'm in a rented apartment, which is what I told him, which is not the most dishonest thing I've ever said, but is not the most truthful either. He asked how things were. I said fine. He talked about the farm and the weather in Clonakilty and his youngest school play. And I listened and made the right sounds, and when we hung up, I sat in the plastic chair and looked at the concrete wall out the window, and I thought about the gap between the Seamus I'd spoken to and the room I was sitting in, and the number that sat between those two things. And I understood why I hadn't told him yet, and I also understood that not telling him was costing me something that the 260,000 euros couldn't be added to, because it was a different kind of cost. The video has 61,000 views. When I watch it at night, which I do sometimes, I try to watch it the way a person watches footage of something that happened to someone else, with the distance of a documentarian rather than the proximity of the man in the barong. I can't always manage it. Sometimes the distance holds and I can watch the drone footage of the house all lit up and think, I built that. That exists because I decided it should, and I had the means to make it happen, and for a period of years it was someone's home, and that's not nothing, whatever else it is. And sometimes the distance doesn't hold, and I watch Grace dancing, and I remember the specific feeling of that evening, the warm air, and the band, and the 200 people, and the sense that I had arrived, finally, at a version of my life that had room in it for something other than loss. And I feel the full weight of the difference between that evening and this room, and it sits on me for a while, and I let it sit because there's nothing else to do with it. I haven't commented on the video. I haven't deleted it. I haven't told anyone in Cork what it would take to explain. My sister Aoife, who is 69 and has always been the more sensible of the two of us, would want to come and sort things out if she knew, and there's nothing to sort. What happened, happened. What it costs has already been paid. What I've been doing in the boarding house, and I want to say this plainly because it's important, is recovering the version of myself that existed before I attached so much of who I was to what I was building. The engineer, the man who listened to engines and heard what they were actually telling him. I've been spending time with Eddie, who comes to the boarding house some afternoons, and who talks to me the way he always talked to me on the ferry, without ceremony and without the social performance that I find exhausting. Just two men who understand machinery talking about the world. I've been walking in the mornings, along the road toward the bay, and the bay here has its own quality that is different from Cork Harbor, and that I've stopped comparing and started just receiving. I rang Kieran last week. Really rang him, not the surface version. I told him the whole thing, the room, the number, the video, the boarding house. He listened for a long time without interrupting, and when I finished he said, "Dad, are you safe?" I said yes. He said, "Do you need money?" I said no. He said, "Do you want to come to London for a while?" I said I wasn't ready to make that decision yet. He said, "Okay. I'm going to ring you on Wednesdays now as well as Sundays if that's all right." I said that would be all right. I said, "You're your mother's son, Kieran." He said, "I know, Dad." And we stayed on the phone a bit longer, and neither of us said anything much, and that was fine. I'm going to tell Seamus next Sunday. I've decided that. The story of the gap between the footage and the room is not a story I can carry alone much longer, and Seamus is a farmer who understands that seasons change and that you don't argue with the change, you adapt to it. He'll say something plain and correct, and then he'll talk about the weather in Clonakilty, and that will be enough. The 61,000 views. I've thought about whether to take the video down, and I've decided not to. And the reason is this. That evening happened. I was in it. 200 people were in it. Grace was in it, and she was happy in it. and that happiness was real at that moment, even if the moment didn't hold. Taking down the video would be trying to revise something that is already fixed in the past, and the past doesn't revise, and a man who spends his energy trying to revise it is a man not spending his energy on what comes next. What comes next I don't fully know. That's the most honest thing I can say. I'm 74 years old, I have a pension and a cracked phone, and a room in Olongapo with morning light for 40 minutes, and I am not the man who danced in that video, and I am also not that man, because the man who danced in that video was real too, and the life he was living at that moment was real, and I do not want to become someone who looks back at a real thing and decides it was only a mistake. It was a real thing that also cost me 260,000 euros and ended in a boarding house. Both of those things are true, and neither of them cancels the other. I've been an engineer for 31 years. I know that a machine can run correctly and still wear out. I know that the failure of something doesn't mean the design was wrong from the start. I know that the sea doesn't care what you think of it, and that the most useful thing you can do on a rough crossing is understand the actual conditions and respond to those, not the conditions you wished you were in. The fan moves the warm air around. The concrete wall catches the light after the morning angle changes. Tomorrow I'll walk to the bay and watch the water for a while. Then I'll come back and ring Seamus and tell him the truth. That's the next thing. That's enough.